In this video, I'm going to show how D2M3's Fusion Lifecycle connector will allow us to connect between SolidWorks PDM Professional and Fusion Lifecycle. Well, first of all, we'll start by having a look at the type of data that we're going to upload to Fusion Lifecycle. The goal, of course, is to generate equivalent items in Fusion Lifecycle for the files in PDM. And we'll start here just by looking at a very simple example, just a single standalone part file. The information that we can extrapolate from a single part file is its file card data and it's the file itself. So either the part file or maybe a PDF generated deliverable of that part file. We're going to look at a more advanced way of exporting data lately, which is where we take into account the configurations of a file and the various configurations bills of materials. And we'll look at that example a little later, but we're going to focus for the time being just on a single file. The way that the export is triggered from inside of PDM is to use a task. And we've created an add-in here that allows us to integrate PDM with Fusion Lifecycle. And we've added that as a task in here. So let's just have a quick look at that task and see how it's been configured. First of all, the execution method. Well, I have configured this to execute as part of a workflow. But for the purposes of the demonstration, rather than me changing the state of all the files, I'm just going to manually run it from a mouse click. And we can do that presuming that we allow a particular account to have permission to run it. But normally we'll execute this as part of the workflow. My laptop has got the add-in installed and I'm using that to be the actual system that executes the task. We can schedule it, but in reality we'll try and do everything as real-time as possible. And then we come to the Fusion Lifecycle settings. So the actual add-in itself is configured to allow us to connect to different lifecycle tenants using different IDs, using different workspace settings. And I'll explain what a workspace setting is in a second. And then we have some very specific PDM settings, which is how we integrate with SolidWorks' product, which is effectively from where do we gather the PDF that we'd like to upload to the Fusion Lifecycle item. And I've got a little folder here that whenever I publish one of my part files or drawing files, a PDF is generated for me and it's placed in that folder using the original file's number from the file card and the original file's revision. And so we can configure where the system is to go and look to find those deliverables. And this is something that we find ourselves kind of customizing a little bit per client, because where these PDFs are being stored and how they're being created seems to differ from one client to another one. Right, that's kind of it. The only other thing to note is, as far as these task add-ins goes, it is possible to raise success emails and error email notifications should you require them. I'll be monitoring my process, so an email is kind of surplus to requirements for me. Now, let's have a look at the settings in Fusion Lifecycle. So we saw a second ago that PDM has to connect to Fusion Lifecycle using a set of credentials. And this is what it's looking for. It's basically an item in Fusion Lifecycle that defines how this particular form of connection is going to behave. What we like about our approach to PDM is that you can generate as many instances of that add-in as a task based on that add-in as you require. So it's possible to configure rules for the uploading of items and bombs, but also maybe say you want to publish quality documents that you're managing in your PDM works to Fusion Lifecycle. You might want slightly different settings or for it to trigger on a different workflow transition than your standard item and bomb properties. Well, fully support all that. You can effectively create as many settings as you need. And each setting basically contains a target workspace into which we're going to create the item. It also contains an ability to label that item as having been created by us. And this is really important because when we build a bill of material, we want to know that we were responsible for the construction of that bill of material. In other words, that bill of material came from the design BOM. If you wish to add your own components to that BOM in Fusion Lifecycle, you can, as long as it's not labeled as having come from our connector. And the next time the connector uploads that item, it will only remove those elements of the BOM that have been labeled as having been created by us and replace with the newer versions as taken from the as designed BOM inside of PDM. The other thing that's quite important with the settings is that we have mapped certain file card properties from PDM to particular fields in the equivalent Fusion Lifecycle item. And you can see we've done this in a grid, so you can add and extend this list as you require. And these properties come in a number of different types, but the key two are that we can upload from PDM to a Fusion Lifecycle item or to a Fusion Lifecycle item's bill of material. So we can pick the precise target of where this property is to go to. It's also possible for us to complete Fusion Lifecycle pick lists with data from inside of PDM and also set defaults. So in this case, with the unit of measure is, if we're not told what the unit of measure is, can you default it to each? So we're trying to take into account as many of the complexities as possible with regards the connection. I'm going to trigger the upload now from PDM. So switch back to my browser, pick the part file. You'll notice there is no bill of material here, and we do have some content on the file card, not a great deal. I've got a part number, I've got a revision, I've got a description, not very exciting, I know. I have a material and a finish. So let's see that information reflected in Fusion. I'm not going to move it through the workflow. Because I'm an admin, I can manually instigate this task. Not something we'd recommend as a general approach because you've got no control of the release of information there. Normally we would say it should always be triggered from a workflow state change. But for demonstration reasons, it's quicker for me to click on a menu. Which now means if I go back into my administration tool, log in properly to the right one. Just have a quick look at the task list. I might have missed it. No, it's just starting up now. So that task is starting. Takes, I guess, my local computer polls every 10, 15, 20 seconds for jobs. It then processes the job. To do a single part seems to take around 6, 10, 11, 12 seconds, something like that, depending really on what it's being tasked to do. It seems the speed and the performance relates more to do with the number of attachments and how big each of those attachments are rather than anything else. So that's done. You can see it's worked okay. It's marked as such, and it took around 20 seconds to create. So let's now go back and have a look at Fusion Lifecycle. This is the target workspace. I purposely cleared it out ahead of this demonstration, so you can see I'm not cheating in any way. However, the item has been created. I just need to refresh the page to see my item. And you can see that the information has been taken from the source file in PDM and written to here. That includes the item number, the description, the material, and the finish. And I've also recorded here the source file name that generated the item and that file's revision. We could, of course, store things like who checked the file in PDM, who approved the file in PDM, who released the file in PDM. Any information that you are storing currently on your file data card can be transposed and uploaded to its equivalent Fusion Lifecycle item. Now, that's not the only thing we've got. Not only have we got the item, but we also have attachments. In this case, my settings effectively said I would like to see both the part file and a PDF of that part file, if it exists, to be attached to the item, and we can see that there. Again, I'm not sure how useful it is to attach the part file. Maybe attaching something like an IGES model or a step file makes a bit more sense than the actual original, but clearly associating the generated PDF, the PDF deliverable, makes sense for the rest of the business to consume this particular item and understand precisely what its nature is. Let's move on to something far more complicated. Let's move on to our multi-configuration assembly. So what is it we expect to achieve, or what is it we expect to see in Fusion Lifecycle from an export of this particular type of file? Well, effectively, according to our current user base, what they would like to see is a specific instance of an item for each of the configurations of the sort file, of the source file. So each configuration will represent a different product that they might sell. And this is reflected more in the bill of material. So it's not necessarily the source file card that differ particularly, but it is the bill of material. So again, we can see here, each of the configurations of that file have a slightly different version of the bill of material. And to represent that in Fusion Lifecycle, we'll need to generate a unique item, one for each of those configurations, so they can each have their own version of that bill of material. And again, I'm going to trigger this using my right-hand mouse button press. Let's just come back into here. The task is being created. It's waiting for the host. Again, this is a much more complicated upload, because not only we've got to take into account each configuration of each file, but also the complexity of building all the relevant BOMs and all the bill of materials. So it might look like there's only so many files in PDM, but in reality, if you extrapolate those files into BOM information, there's actually dozens of parts and lots of relationships that we need to build. So this process of uploading this is actually going to take a couple of minutes. So I'll just pause the video until the upload has been completed. So I've allowed this process to continue for a minute or two. Let's come and, rather than waiting for it all to finish, let's have a look at what it's done. It's actually built a number of the items for me. You can see everything in here. In fact, it's built item, the configuration, it's built the item from configuration 1 of the assembly and so on, and 2 and 3. So let's see what we've got when we look at version 1. Again, we've got all the properties filled in, including we know what the source file is that it's come from. We also know what the configuration ID is that this particular item's come from. To be clear about that, that is just simply a property on the file card that distinguishes one configuration from another one. We did think about using the configuration name, but configuration names can be changed really quickly and really easily, and we need something to be known as a fact and actually be something that's unlikely to be changed. So we've added this little the configuration ID just to give us that piece of information that we need. Now, further examination of this shows us that the original assembly file has been uploaded, and you do have this really neat ability in Fusion to download that particular file and any of the attachments or any of its bill of materials related files as well. That's available in here. We have a quick look over at the bill of material tab. We can see that it's constructed the bill of material for me. The 5 here refers to how many root items there are underneath the item I'm looking at, not how many items in completely are in this bill of material. We'd have to expand the bill of material like that. And that's what I mean about there being lots of data. Certainly in a multi-configuration environment, there's actually an awful lot of information that we got to process through for the upload to occur. So you can see that not only have we taken a single part file and uploaded it with all its relevant attachments, but we've also created some complex bill of materials, even deriving those bills of materials from various configurations of the source file. If we have a look at another configuration of the main assembly, you can see that its bill of material is decidedly different. And let's see, for 3, again, I think the quantities are slightly different between the two of them. We'd have to do a BOM comparison to see precisely what the differences are. The last segment of this video deals with change. How do we upload change to the equivalent item in Fusion Lifecycle? So how do we, when we redesign a part, how do we, when we redesign an assembly, does the equivalent items get changed? Well, the first thing to note is that any item in Fusion Lifecycle can be released. What we will never do is change a released item. That's not our role. That's not our job. That's something that, if that needs to be done, has to be done by somebody who's qualified and has the correct permissions. If we're going to change something, we're going to change the working version. And you'll note here that my original version of my idler arm had a description of idler arm new 005, and it was linked to revision C of the part file. If we have a look at the working version of that item, i.e. the version that I can change because this information's not yet been released, then all that information currently matches. It's the same. What I'm going to do now is go back to PDM. I'm going to make changes just to the file card. I'm not going to do any design changes here today. So I'm just going to, in fact, actually what I need to do before I check it out is change the state and move it to a work in progress state rather. So now under editing, I'm going to check that out so I can make the changes that I need. I'm going to do something really easy. I'm just going to change the number here to idler arm new update, so it's really obvious what we've done. You can also see the revision changed, of course. I'm going to save that, check that back in, and this time, rather than me triggering this upload from the right hand mouse button menu, I'm going to change the state and release it, and this will trigger the upload. So in reality, it's more typical that that's how the event triggers the upload operation. So if we have a quick look in our task list, there you go, we can see that a new upload is about to begin. Just waiting for the host to kick this in. Starting up. And processing. It's already 10 seconds into the process. I think it'll only be a few seconds more just for this simple change. And rather than watching that there, I think what we'll do, we'll go back to the item and we'll just refresh the page in here, and that will then show us when something's changed. Now I know immediately that something's different because this little icon here tells me that my working version is different than the previous production version. So I can see by switching between those two that effectively the description here is being modified, and also the file revision has gone from C to D, and that is how we do updates. We only ever affect the working version. Just a quick note on bills of materials. We effectively remove any element of the bill of material that we created and we rebuild it when the next release of the assembly is done. And that's for many, many reasons. But the key one being, it's quite hard for us to understand if the quantity, for example, of an item in the bill of material has been adjusted by you manually for a reason that's different, especially if it's different from what the design says. So if you've added 2 spare parts, we don't know whether that was the previous design had 2 extra parts in it and now it has 2 less, or whether they've been added as spares. So anything that we've added to the bill of material will be removed by us and recreated. However, if you do want to add spares and add your own components to the BOM, you can do so, just as long as the bill of material hasn't been marked as having come from us. And to give you an example of that, and just to highlight what I mean by we know which elements in this bill of material have come from us, is that we set this bill of material property called source to saying DBOM. So I know that the as designed BOM that was generated in PDM has in fact created that item. If you wish to add your own item to that, you can, and as long as the source isn't labeled as DBOM, we'll leave it alone. We won't change it, we won't remove it. And that's it, really. So thank you for listening and watching. If you have any more questions, then please contact sales@d2m3.com. Thank you.